Ava, we can't. Julian's voice cracked, his hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. His dark eyes flickered to mine, searching, pleading, but there was something else there too, something that mirrored the heat simmering in my chest. I knew this was wrong. I knew it the moment I stepped into their home and felt that inexplicable pull toward him. But here we were, standing too close, the air between us charged with something neither of us could name yet refused to ignore. "You didn't stop me," I whispered, my voice trembling as I took a step closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the unspoken words between us. "You didn't push me away." Julian's jaw tightened, his breath hitching as I reached out, my fingers brushing against his arm. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through me that I wouldn't ignore. He was warm, so warm, and the faint scent of his cologne enveloped me, intoxicating and forbidden. "Ava, you're her mother," he finally said, his voice strained, but there was no conviction in it. No real resistance. If anything, it sounded like a plea for me to convince him, to tell him that this was okay. That we were okay. "And you're her husband?" I shot back, my voice barely above a whisper. My hand slid up his arm, my fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt. "But look at us, Julian. Look at where we are." It had started innocently enough. A visit. Just a visit. That's what I told myself when I packed my bag and drove to Ruby and Julian's home. It had been months since I'd seen my daughter, and I missed her. Or at least I thought I did. But when Julian opened the door, something shifted. Something I couldn't explain. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. His dark hair was slightly messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his smile was warm but guarded. There was something about him, something calm and steady that immediately drew me in. "Welcome, Ava," he said, his voice deep and smooth, like velvet. "Ruby's just finishing up in the kitchen." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the way my stomach fluttered at the sound of his voice. "Thank you, Julian. It's good to see you again." But it wasn't just good. It was something else entirely. That first night, I found myself watching him. It was subtle, or so I told myself. A glance here, a lingering look there. He was different from Ruby's previous boyfriends. There was a maturity about him, a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. And the way he looked at her, so tender, so protective, it stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years. I tried to distract myself. Cooking, cleaning, anything to keep my mind off the unwelcome thoughts creeping in. But every time I looked at him, it was like the room shifted, as if the air between us had thickened, charged with something neither of us dared to acknowledge. And then there was the way he spoke to me. Soft, almost intimate, as if he knew exactly how his words affected me. It wasn't intentional, I was sure of it. Julian wasn't that kind of man. But that didn't stop the way my pulse quickened every time he looked my way. "Ruby's leaving for that conference tomorrow," Julian said one evening, his voice breaking the silence that had settled over the dinner table. "She'll be gone for a few days." I nodded, trying to ignore the way my heart skipped at the news. "That's good. She's been looking forward to it." "She's excited," Julian agreed, his eyes meeting mine across the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I should leave. I should pack my things and go before this goes any further. But I didn't. I stayed. And when Ruby left the next morning, the house felt different. Smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in on us, forcing us closer together. Now, standing in the kitchen with Julian, I could feel the tension between us like a living thing, pulsing and raw. His chest rose and fell with each breath, his eyes never leaving mine. I could see the conflict in them. The war between what he wanted and what he knew was right. "You're driving me crazy," he finally admitted, his voice low and rough. "I've tried to ignore it, Ava. I've tried to push it away, but I can't." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew then that I wasn't alone in this. That he felt it too, this undeniable pull between us. "Then don't," I whispered, my fingers tightening around his shirt. "Don't push it away, Julian. Not this time." He hesitated, his hands hovering at his sides as if he were afraid to touch me. But then slowly, so slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. The contact was gentle, almost reverent, and I felt my knees weaken beneath me. "This is wrong," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "We both know it." "But it feels right," I countered, leaning into his touch. "Doesn't it?" He didn't answer. Not with words, at least. Instead, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, but undeniably electric. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of desire, of everything we'd been too afraid to say. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the guilt, not the fear, not the consequences. All that mattered was him. And me. And us. Julian's hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. His touch was firm yet gentle, as if he were afraid I might break. But I didn't want gentle. I wanted more, so much more. Do you feel it too? I whispered against his lips, my voice trembling with the weight of my confession. This need. He didn't answer. Not with words. But the way he kissed me, deep and desperate, told me everything I needed to know. And as I melted into him, I knew there was no going back. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. Ruby's excitement about her upcoming conference filled the house, her energy infectious and oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. She talked animatedly at breakfast, her hands gesturing wildly as she described the keynote speakers and networking opportunities. I tried to focus on her words, but my attention kept drifting to Julian. He sat quietly beside her, his eyes occasionally flicking to mine, holding a depth of emotion that made my heart race. "Mom, you'll be okay here while I'm gone, right?" Ruby asked, snapping me back to the conversation. "Of course, darling," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine. You just focus on your conference. I'm so proud of you." She beamed, leaning over to squeeze my hand. "Thanks, Mom. It's a huge opportunity, and I'm so excited. But I'll miss you both." "We'll miss you too," Julian said, his voice steady, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. My stomach twisted with guilt and something else I couldn't quite name. The morning of Ruby's departure arrived too soon. She bustled around the house, double-checking her itinerary and packing last-minute items. I stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her with a mix of pride and unease. "Julian, do you have my charger?" she called, rummaging through her bag. "It's in the car," he replied from behind me. I turned to find him standing close, his presence overwhelming. Our eyes met, and for a second, the world narrowed to just the two of us. Good, Ruby said, zipping up her suitcase. She glanced at the clock. "I should get going. Traffic's going to be a nightmare." I followed her downstairs, Julian trailing behind. At the front door, Ruby hugged me tightly. "Take care of yourself, Mom. I'll call you when I land." "Safe travels, sweetheart," I said, holding her close. Over her shoulder, I saw Julian watching us, his expression unreadable. When she pulled away, she turned to Julian. "Take care of her," she said with a playful smile. "Always," he murmured, his eyes flicking to mine. As the door closed behind her, the house felt unnervingly quiet. Julian and I stood in the foyer, the air thick with tension neither of us dared to break. I busied myself by tidying the kitchen, anything to distract from the thoughts swirling in my mind. But I could feel his presence like a magnet, pulling me in. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "No, I'm fine," I replied, though my hands trembled as I wiped down the counter. He stepped closer, his warmth radiating through the space between us. "Ava." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. The look in his eyes was undeniable, filled with longing and conflict. "Don't," I whispered, though my body betrayed me, leaning slightly toward him. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted, his voice low. "About us." "Julian, this is wrong," I said, but the words felt hollow even to me. "Is it?" he asked, stepping closer still. "Because it doesn't feel wrong. It feels inevitable." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of desire clouding my judgment. "We can't. Ruby." "Ruby doesn't have to know," he interrupted, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me and I gasped softly. "And what happens when she finds out?" I asked, though part of me didn't care. The pull between us was too strong to resist. He didn't answer. Instead, he closed the distance between us, his body pressing against mine. His hands cupped my face, his touch both tender and insistent. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. I should have. I knew I should have. But instead I whispered, "Don't." His lips crashed into mine, the kiss fierce and desperate, as if he'd been holding back for too long. My hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting to erase the space between us. Every touch, every caress ignited something deep within me, a hunger I hadn't felt in years. He broke the kiss just long enough to murmur, "You're all I can think about," before his lips found mine again. His hands roamed my body, exploring, claiming, and I surrendered completely to the sensation. We stumbled backward, our movements frantic and uncoordinated, until my back hit the wall. His body pressed against mine, pinning me in place. I could feel the heat of him, the strength of his desire, and it thrilled me in ways I couldn't articulate. "Julian," I breathed, my voice a plea and a warning all at once. "I need you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've needed you from the moment you walked into this house." His words shattered the last of my resistance. I pulled him closer, my body molding to his, our kisses growing deeper, more urgent. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only him, only this. As his lips trailed down my neck, I tilted my head back, giving him full access. His hands slipped under my shirt, exploring the curve of my waist, and I shivered under his touch. Every nerve in my body was alive, every sensation amplified. "Tell me what you want," he murmured against my skin. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before whispering, "You. I want you." He didn't need to be told twice. His hands gripped my hips, lifting me effortlessly as I wrapped my legs around his waist. Our eyes locked, and in that moment there was no guilt, no fear. Just us and the undeniable connection that drew us together. He carried me to the couch, my back sinking into the cushions as he hovered above me. His lips found mine again, the kiss slow and lingering, as if he were savoring every moment. His hands roamed my body, leaving trails of fire in their wake. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a husky whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. More than anything, he didn't need any more encouragement. His hands found the hem of my shirt, pulling it over my head, and I gasped as the cool air hit my skin. His gaze raked over me, filled with awe and desire, and I felt a thrill of power knowing I could affect him so deeply. His lips descended on mine again, the kiss deepening as his hands explored every inch of me. I arched into his touch, every nerve ending alight with sensation. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us and the undeniable pull of our connection. As his lips trailed down my neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake, I gasped, unable to contain the emotion surging through me. "Julian." He looked up, his eyes dark with desire. "Tell me what you want." I hesitated for a moment, the weight of our actions pressing down on me. But then I looked into his eyes, and all I could see was the raw, unguarded emotion shining through. "You," I whispered. "I want you." He didn't need to be told twice. His lips found mine again, the kiss fierce and desperate, as if he couldn't get enough of me. His hands roamed my body, exploring every curve, and I surrendered completely to the sensation. As the world around us faded away, I knew there was no going back. This was our moment, our forbidden embrace, and I was willing to face whatever consequences came next. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. I stirred awake, the warmth of Julian's body still pressed against mine. His arm draped over my waist, pulling me closer even in sleep. My heart raced as the reality of what we'd done settled in. This is wrong, I thought, but the memory of his touch sent a shiver down my spine, erasing any lingering doubts. I carefully slipped out of bed, not wanting to wake him. The floor was cool beneath my feet as I padded to the bathroom. Standing in front of the mirror, I stared at my reflection, trying to reconcile the woman staring back with the one who had crossed such a profound line just hours ago. My cheeks were flushed, my lips slightly swollen from Julian's kisses. I couldn't help but smile, despite the guilt gnawing at the edges of my mind. When I returned to the bedroom, Julian was awake, propped up on one elbow, his gaze intense as it followed my every move. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The air between us was charged, the weight of our actions still hanging heavily in the room. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm as I sat on the edge of the bed. "Why are you so far away, Ava?" His tone was soft, but there was an underlying urgency that sent a thrill through me. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed a moment to think. "This is complicated, Julian." He sat up, his expression serious. "I know it is, but that doesn't change how I feel about you." His hand found mine, intertwining our fingers. "Last night wasn't just a mistake, Ava. It meant something to me." I looked down at our joined hands, my mind racing. How could this have happened? I knew the answer, of course. It had been building for weeks, months even. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, the way my heart raced whenever he was near. It was as if we'd been drawn together by some invisible force, one that was impossible to resist. It meant something to me too, I admitted, my voice trembling. "But what about Ruby? What about everything we're risking?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Ava. I wish I had all the answers. But I do know that I can't keep pretending like I don't feel this way. I can't keep ignoring what's between us." His words sent a wave of warmth through me, but the reality of our situation was a heavy weight on my shoulders. "We can't just throw everything away, Julian. Ruby, she's my daughter. She's your wife." He nodded, his expression pained. I know, and I don't want to hurt her, but I can't ignore this anymore. I can't ignore you. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, the conflicting emotions threatening to overwhelm me. What are we supposed to do? We can't keep this a secret forever. He pulled me into his arms, his embrace warm and comforting. I don't know, Ava, but we'll figure it out. Together. For a moment, I allowed myself to sink into his embrace, to forget about the world outside this room. But the guilt was still there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of what we were risking. Later that day, we tried to go about our usual routines, but the tension between us was palpable. Every glance, every touch was charged with an energy that was impossible to ignore. It felt as if we were living in a bubble, separated from the rest of the world by the intensity of our connection. As the afternoon turned into evening, Julian suggested we take a walk. The air was cool, the sun just beginning to set as we made our way down the quiet suburban streets. We walked in silence for a while, the sound of our footsteps the only thing breaking the stillness. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice low and hesitant. Ava, do you regret what happened? I stopped walking, turning to face him. His eyes searched mine, desperate for an answer. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I don't regret it, Julian, but I'm scared. Scared of what this means, scared of what we're risking. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. I'm scared too, but I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you. His words sent a thrill through me, but the fear was still there, a constant reminder of the consequences we faced. We can't just pretend like this isn't happening, Julian. Sooner or later, we're going to have to face the reality of what we've done. He nodded, his expression serious. I know, but for now, can we just enjoy this? Just for a little while. I looked into his eyes, the emotion shining through so raw and unfiltered that it took my breath away. Okay, I whispered. Just for a little while. He pulled me into his arms, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. In that moment, the world around us faded away, leaving just the two of us, lost in our forbidden embrace. As we walked back to the house, hand in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something both dangerous and beautiful. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now I was willing to take the risk, to see where this path would lead us. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and lingering touches. Ruby's absence stretched on. Her conference extended by a few more days due to unforeseen circumstances. Each passing hour felt like both a gift and a curse. A gift because it gave Julian and me more time together, and a curse because it only deepened the guilt gnawing at the edges of my conscience. We were careful, of course. We maintained the facade of normality whenever we were outside the confines of the house. Julian went to work as usual, and I busied myself with small tasks, cooking, cleaning, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But the moment he stepped through the door each evening, the air between us shifted. It was as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision of our desires. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, I felt his presence before I even heard his footsteps. The heat of his body pressed against my back, his arms wrapping around my waist. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. This is wrong, a voice in my head whispered, but it was drowned out by the pounding of my heart. Ava, he murmured, his lips brushing against the curve of my neck. I can't stop thinking about you. I closed my eyes, letting myself lean into him for just a moment before pulling away. Julian, we can't keep doing this. He stepped back, his expression a mix of frustration and longing. Why not? Ruby's not here. No one has to know. I know, I said, turning to face him. And you know, that's enough. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze dropping to the floor. I know it's complicated, but I've never felt like this before. Not with Ruby, not with anyone. It's like you see me, really see me, in a way no one else ever has. His words struck a chord deep within me, echoing the very thoughts I had been too afraid to voice. I did see him, not just as my daughter's husband, but as a man complex and conflicted, searching for something more. And in that moment I realized I was searching too. Julian. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his cheek. This isn't just about physical attraction, is it? He shook his head, his eyes locking onto mine. No, it's more than that. So much more. I felt my resolve crumbling, the weight of his words pressing down on me. How could something that felt so right be so wrong? How could I deny what was growing between us when it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known was incomplete? We're playing with fire, I whispered, my voice trembling. If Ruby finds out. She won't, he said quickly, stepping closer. We'll be careful. We'll figure it out. Please, Ava, don't shut me out. I searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt, any hint that he might regret this path we were on. But all I saw was sincerity, raw and unfiltered. And in that moment, I made a choice that would change everything. I cupped his face in my hands, my thumbs brushing against his stubble. Okay, I said softly, but we have to be smart about this. We can't let anyone suspect anything, especially Ruby. He nodded, relief washing over his features. I promise. We'll keep it between us. And just like that, the dam broke. He pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and tenderness. I melted into him, my hands tangling in his hair as I surrendered to the storm raging inside me. Later, as we lay tangled together in the dim light of the bedroom, I traced idle patterns on his chest, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What happens when Ruby comes back? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled slowly, his arm tightening around me. I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Together. I wanted to believe him, to trust that we could navigate the treacherous waters we were in. But a part of me couldn't shake the fear that this was only the beginning of something that would inevitably end in heartbreak. Julian, I said, propping myself up on one elbow to look at him. Promise me something. Anything, he said without hesitation. Promise me that no matter what happens, we'll always be honest with each other. No secrets, no lies. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. I promise, Ava. No secrets, no lies. I smiled, leaning down to kiss him gently. But as I settled back into his embrace, the weight of our choices settled over me like a heavy blanket. We were walking a tightrope, and one misstep could send us both tumbling into chaos. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Julian's phone buzzing on the nightstand. He groaned, rolling over to grab it, and I saw his expression shift as he read the message on the screen. What is it? I asked, sitting up slightly. Ruby, he said, his voice tinged with unease. She's coming back today. My stomach dropped, a wave of panic washing over me. When? This afternoon. We stared at each other, the reality of the situation sinking in. The bubble we had been living in was about to burst, and I wasn't ready to face what came next. We need to talk, I said finally, my voice steadied despite the turmoil inside me. Before she gets here. He nodded, sitting up and running a hand through his hair. I know, but what do we even say? I looked at him, searching for the answer I knew neither of us had. I don't know, Julian, but we have to figure it out. We can't keep living like this. He reached for my hand, lacing our fingers together. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Remember? No secrets, no lies. I squeezed his hand, trying to draw strength from his words. But as I got up to start the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of a precipice, and the fall was inevitable. When Ruby arrived that afternoon, her excitement was palpable. I'm so glad to be home, she said, wrapping me in a tight hug. I missed you both so much. We missed you too, I said, forcing a smile. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Julian shift uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to me briefly before he turned his attention to Ruby. As we sat down to dinner, the tension between Julian and me was almost tangible. Every glance, every word, felt charged with unspoken meaning. Ruby, blissfully unaware, chatted animatedly about the conference, her enthusiasm a stark contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface. After dinner, I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. But before I could even take a breath, Julian appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Ava, he said quietly, we need to talk. I glanced over his shoulder, making sure Ruby wasn't within earshot. Not now. It's too risky. Then when? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. We can't keep pretending everything's fine. I opened my mouth to respond. But before I could, Ruby's voice called out from the living room. Julian, where did you go? He hesitated, his eyes locked on mine. I have to. Go, I said, cutting him off. We'll talk later. He nodded reluctantly before turning and disappearing into the living room. I leaned against the counter, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up the charade. Later that evening, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft knock on the door. Before I could respond, it creaked open and Julian slipped inside, his figure silhouetted in the dim light. I couldn't wait, he whispered, closing the door behind him. We need to figure this out, Ava. I can't keep. His words trailed off as I sat up, the sheets pooling around my waist. Julian, we can't. But he crossed the room in 2 quick strides, his hands finding my face as he kissed me with a desperation that left me breathless. I wanted to push him away, to remind him of the danger we were in, but the heat of his touch melted my resolve. "Ava," he murmured against my lips. "I can't lose you." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the sound of footsteps in the hallway froze us both in place. Our eyes locked, panic flashing in his gaze as the doorknob began to turn.